All right, Talmudim Way, Gospel Backgrounds, Lesson 25, Upon This Rock. We're going to be in Mark 7:31 through chapter 9, verse 1. Got a lot to cover in this one, so let's get started. We always want to start with Acts 17:11. Don't believe anything that any commentator says or anything I say, but always check it out for yourself in the scriptures. All right, so some topics for this one. What struck me as I was going through this is that remember that in some way each of the people Jesus interacts with represents some facet of my personality and your personality. So the deaf and possibly mute man, or at least have some kind of speech impediment, that's healed. The crowd of 4,000 who receives the miracle bread from heaven, they love it. Love it when Jesus gives us free stuff. The skeptical, prideful Pharisees, the corrupt Sadducees, and then the lustful and indulgent Herodians. So hopefully we're not like those groups very often, but we know that those are a part of who we can be, and we need to keep those in check. The dense and obtuse disciples we're going to meet in this lesson, the blind man at Bethsaida, and then of course we're Peter when he gets it right, hopefully more often than Peter when he gets it wrong. And then basically in this lesson, Jesus is going to teach us about what Messiah means to him and how different that is from the picture of Messiah that the disciples have. All right, busy lesson. There are 8 events on this map from the Satellite Bible Atlas, and we're going to cover 6 of them here. So let's zoom in for a closer look here. We concluded the last lesson with Jesus in the region of Tyre and Sidon. That's box number 1. And he healed the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, which we looked at last time. He's then going to take the long way back through Gaulonitis, which we would know today as the Golan Heights. You can hear the linguistic connection there. And then down to the area of the Decapolis. And again, Decapolis just means 10 cities. So we see that he seems to be avoiding the region of Galilee, and there could be a couple of reasons for this. One, the region of Galilee was Herod Antipas's territory, and we know that there's some confrontation happening there. And then also Jesus could strategically be avoiding this area of the devout location of the Sea of Galilee, which is where the Jerusalem temple authorities would have had people kind of looking out for him. So anyway, it seems to be a bit of a cat and mouse game going on. Jesus is ultimately going to face both Herod and the temple authorities, but he's going to do it on his timeline. So along the way, Jesus is going to heal a deaf man with some sort of speech disorder. And then down here, box 3, we have the feeding of the 4,000. Then we're going to have an adversarial line of questioning. He's going to cross over in a place which Mark calls Dalmanutha, which means something like harbor town, and we don't have a whole lot of evidence of where this location is, but Matthew calls this Magadan, and this leads some scholars to believe that this is Magdala on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. You can see right here near box 4. Then he's going to cross over to Bethsaida in the northeast corner, and we have this curious healing of a blind man that actually takes 2 attempts to get him to see. So we'll look at maybe what's going on there. And then after this, we're going to follow this gold line here and head back up north, all the way to the extreme north. Even today, it's the extreme north of Israel, at the foot of Mount Hermon, to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And it's an absolutely beautiful region, and it's famous for the Jesus question, "Who do you say I am?" And then Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." And then box 7 is Transfiguration, which we will save that for the next lesson. All right, so let's get started with Mark 7, verse 31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. So as we've shown on the map, he didn't go to the northwestern area, Capernaum. He went around to the eastern shore. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on them. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. He looked up to heaven, he sighed, and said to him, Ephphatha, which is to say, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. I love how they zealously proclaimed it. So, question there is, how are we doing at zealously proclaiming? And then, of course, he has done all things well. He's the author and finisher of our faith. He is the perfect man that takes that lived a perfect life in our stead. So, as we discussed when we looked at the map, he traveled around the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee rather than across it, probably to avoid Herod Antipas. The hill you see here is the city of Hippos. And if we remember back on the Sermon on the Mount, this would have been visible from the Sermon on the Mount area, which would have been the northern side up here where my pointer is. And it's at that time would have had lights, and so it would have been that shining literal city on a hill, and Jesus is drawing a comparison there. So Mark tells us that Jesus took the man aside privately. Keener in his commentary notes that crowds normally gathered to see magicians do their tricks, and the crowd would have preferred to see Jesus heal a man in front of them, although he does not do so. So he's doing things in private, and this is kind of leading up to taking the disciples away from the Sea of Galilee up into a private area where he's going to give them some information. It's possible that the crowds gathered. This is the same region where the demoniac was healed, and the story of the pigs and all that. It's possible that that man's testimony led to the crowds forming here. So it's kind of cool to make that connection. In Isaiah 35, it says, "The eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped." And so it's basically Jesus is fulfilling prophecy here. Mark provides an unusual amount of detail for this miracle. The theme of this section will be spiritual deafness and spiritual blindness, and we'll see at the end how basically all of this is for the disciples' benefit, to open their eyes and open their ears. They need further explanation to really understand Jesus' mission. And unfortunately, for the most part, they will not have their eyes opened really until the resurrection. In those days, chapter 8, in those days when again a great crowd had gathered, they had nothing to eat. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away." And his disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. Dr. Bolin notes that several indications in the text suggest the event occurred around this Gentile territory. We have verse 31 of chapter 7. And then after the feeding of the 4,000, it says Jesus will depart to the other side, which brings him back to the Jewish area of the northern side of the lake. So the feeding of the 4,000, again, we talked about earlier, could have taken place in the same area of Gadara, which is where the previous miracle of the demoniac was told. Remember, he was told to go in and tell others what Jesus had done for him. So the crowd who brought this deaf man could have been, kind of a direct result of that testimony. Interesting that it appears that Jesus was out in the countryside, so there would have been no city within walking distance where one could quickly buy a large quantity of food. So there was a need for a miracle here. Here's a city street at Gadara. If the testimony of the demoniac brought some of the crowds, it's possible that they traveled from along this road to Gadara. When the disciples ask, "How could one feed so many?" There's kind of two options here. Either the disciples completely forgot about the last miracle and the feeding of the 5,000, but probably more likely they clearly remembered that miracle and were kind of prompting, maybe egging Jesus along to repeat it. And this time, at least they had the starter provisions with them. They didn't have to go find them somewhere else. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, which he did before, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before him. So the bread first, and then the fish. And then they ate and were satisfied. And then they took the pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. So impossible to note the connection with the 5,000. We had 12 baskets left over, and with the 4,000, we have 7 baskets. Some see the 12 baskets as representing Israel, with then the 7 baskets representing the nations. That could be the first miracle really took place with near Bethsaida, with really within Israel proper, while this second miracle took place within the Gentile regions. In rabbinic numerology, 70 is the number that represents the nations, and this comes from Genesis 11 and the table of 70 nations. So, by extension, we can have 7 representing Gentile lands. So then the progression from 12 to 7 might symbolize the progression of the kingdom from Israel, starting in Israel, then going out to the nations. Then we'd have the leftovers alluding to the crumbs given to the Gentiles spoken of by the Syrophoenician woman that we talked about in the last session. 7 is also the number of completion, and this is probably more more along the lines of what the symbolism might be. There were 7 days of creation, and of course, the number 7 runs throughout the Bible. Or, as Lancaster says, it could just be that there were 12 baskets the first time and 7 baskets this time. Not everything has to have a hidden meaning. All right, so let's pick up the Mark passage here. After sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. And then this is where Mark says Dalmanutha, which basically means harbor town or something along those lines. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test him, and they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered them, when it is evening, you say it will be fair, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. And then Mark also picks up that Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit, which would be the second time that Jesus sighed in this passage, and we'll kind of unpack that a little bit down the road. So Lancaster sees this potential that Jesus is kind of toying with them a little bit. So they ask for a sign from heaven, which in Hebrew is the word shemayim, and Jesus answers them with a sign from the literal sky, which is also the same word, shemayim. So he's engaging in some wordplay here. You might not have known that the sailor's ditty, "Red sky at night, sailor's delight; red sky at morning, sailor take warning." That comes right here from the Bible. You may not know that. Well, now you do. The things you learn by doing this study here. Of course, Jesus is saying they can read the literal shemayim, the literal sky, but they are too blind to see the spiritual shemayim, and so the spiritual blindness theme is running through here. The word shemayim is also noteworthy because it appears in the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. I'll read that in Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et ha shemayim, and there's the word in blue there, the et ha aretz. We talked earlier about the patterns of 7. You'll count that there are 7 words here, and there are 28 letters. So we have 7 divided by 4, all in the first verse of the Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim is like the first phrase. There's 14 letters there. Et hashamayim ve'et haaretz is the second phrase, and there are also 14 letters, 7 divided by 2. So I'm starting to think that God has a thing about the number 7. But anyway, this is the anytime there's any of these words that appears in Scripture, it's noteworthy because just the sages put such a high hold Genesis 1:1 at such high esteem that it kind of gets your attention. All right, this is a picture of the area of Magdala, and because Mark calls this Dalmanutha, that just means harbor town. We don't really know where that is, but Matthew calls this Magadan. It's plausible that Magdala could have been in view here. It was a great, fantastic harbor and fishing time in the time of the first century. There's also a great Messianic guest house, and that's where this picture was taken from. Sarah and I had the joy of staying here, and it has amazing views of the northern shore, where really all of the Sea of Galilee events kind of played out, and you can see it kind of right in front of you. It's really really cool place. But let's get back to our narrative here. So the authorities asking for a sign seems really peculiar because Jesus has done nothing but miracles and healings. Keener notes that in his commentary that the ancient literature sometimes uses the denseness of one's opponents to underline the protagonist's virtue. In other words, by he's contrasting Jesus' perfect vision with the kind of the spiritual blindness of the leadership. And at first that made me smile or smirk, but then if you read on in in this passage, you're going to see the disciples are just as spiritually blind. So, because they represent us, that pitches a little bit because that has some important implications. In any case, Jesus is not about to perform some parlor trick just to satisfy this crowd. He gave them only a sign of the prophet Jonah, and he didn't even bother to explain that. Fortunately for us, he does later, where he says that just as Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will spend 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. So basically, just as Jonah survived the ordeal and lived again, Jesus will too. There's an apocryphal book called the Gospel of Thomas, and the parallel passage there has the leaders asking, "Tell us who you are, so that we may believe in you." And we touched on this when we looked at John chapter 6. This sounds very much like something the establishment would have said. In other words, they don't want to see just any sign. They are really, what they're saying is they demand Jesus submit his candidacy to their authority for their review and approval. So that's the underlying thing. They don't just want to see some miracle. They want him to submit to them, and Jesus is not about to do that. About the only thing the Pharisees, Sadducees, and then, as Mark says, the Herodians had in common was this need to hold on to their power and be seen as in charge. And Jesus, in that respect, is a threat to all three groups, and we'll touch on that a little bit later down the road as Jesus unpacks kind of what is happening here. Mark notes that Jesus sighs again, and in fact, this time the Greek is more emphatic, like Jesus exasperated with this group. So just like he did with the deaf man, he sighed there as well. The leadership has ears but would not hear, right? So he sighed deeply in his spirit. Is a form of exasperation. It could also be a form of prayer, because Romans 8:26 says the Spirit Himself intercedes with us with groanings too deep for words. So there could be that kind of prayer going on, and a sadness, because this is the very group that should have accepted Him and should have known that Jesus was the Messiah, and yet the very group that turns out to reject Him. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So now we're sailing from Magdala area to Bethsaida. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Matthew picks up, "Watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Robinson, in his Harmony, calls this the fourth retirement to Bethsaida in the territory of Herod Philip, with sharp rebuke of the dullness of the disciples. And I love that. So 8:22 says they came to the area of Bethsaida, so opposite Magdala. Magdala is located on the northwestern side of the Sea of Galilee, and the plain of Bethsaida is located on the northeastern side. So now you might remember this picture. We're back in the area where the feeding of the 5,000 occurred. At verse 14, Keener says the disciples concerned over not having enough bread is kind of reasonable in human terms. They're apparently headed for the east side of the lake, which was less populated, although there was bread to be found in Bethsaida. And then he continues, their concern is heightened because bringing provisions had been their responsibility as disciples. Teachers often delegated such matters to their disciples. So Lancaster notes on kind of answering the question, what is the leaven of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and that of Herod? It's often taught that that refers to Judaism with its laws and its strange rituals. So we need to be reminded again that this is introducing something into the text that Jesus absolutely could not have intended. This split didn't happen until at least 100 and probably more like 200 to 300 years after Jesus was crucified. And if you want that in context, 300 years is longer than America has been around as a nation. So we know also from our diligent review, we've talked about a lot, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians didn't have a single thing in common other than the enemy of the enemy is my friend. So that Jesus was kind of the glue that brought all of them together. They all agreed that for different reasons, Jesus was a threat to each group. And so then, the higher ranking members of each group then concluded he needed to be eliminated, and then they began to conspire together to achieve this. And Jesus, aware of this, meaning the kind of the cluelessness of the disciples, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes you do not see, so there's the blindness and deafness happening here, and having ears you do not hear, and you do not remember. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full did you take up? And they said 7. Do you not understand? And then Matthew at least answers the question. They understood he did not tell them to be aware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. To verse 22, and then they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes, he laid his hands on him, saying, Do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, Do not even enter the village. When I was in Bethsaida in 2013, it was slightly hazy. So these trees that are here in the background here kind of reminded me of this scene. And of course, we studied this passage when we were there. So this kind of the faint haziness is what this man might have seen. So this is an Iron Age gate, about 800 years before the time of Jesus. This is a very cool site with some lots of excavation going on in Bethsaida. So we note the parallels that for the deaf man, Jesus led him away from the crowd. He does the same here with the blind man, and then we're about to see that Jesus is going to take the disciples out of Galilee to teach them privately. So there's definitely some kind of connection going on there with Jesus now being more private. The healing, this healing is the only two-stage ministry that's recorded, and it seems strange. Of course, we know that Jesus didn't even need to be in the same city to heal someone. So, kind of why didn't it work the first time? Keener notes that this probably represents an acted-out parable. We see some of the Old Testament prophets doing this, lie on their side for a while and then turn over and lie on the other side, kind of thing. Basically, this ties together the totally blind authorities and the partially blind disciples. This is really a picture of the disciples. They're beginning to see, but in a sense, they are still blind until Jesus will touch them again at his resurrection. So there's kind of a picture of the, and really this whole episode is a picture of the disciples, gradually, slowly gaining sight, but they can't see completely clearly. The Messiah basically that they were expecting was before them, but it was not the one that they were expecting. So their picture remained out of focus. Now we're going to move on to the famous area of Caesarea Philippi, and it's just a gorgeous area, and some momentous things happened here. So we'll flip over to the Matthew version here. Now, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or another one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And then in his finest hour, Simon Peter replied, "You are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God." So just to get our overall bearings, Caesarea Philippi is way up here in the north, and even today, it's about as far north as you can go in the modern country of Israel, and it was today. In fact, they have a saying from this is the area of Dan. I don't know if you can read that tribe area of Dan. They will say from Dan to Beersheba as a kind of an idiom for the whole land, like from Maine to California, kind of thing, where we would say it in America. So although Philip the Tetrarch was the Jewish king, his capital city was not a Jewish city. So he had his capital in Caesarea Philippi, and it was pagan in kind of every way imaginable. Population, culture. It had temples and idols that were dedicated to all kinds of deities. It had unspeakable, detestable practices going on, and it was really maybe we might say it was so bad it would make Las Vegas blush. Or Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi might say, "You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy." So we have to contrast this. This is a very unlikely place to bring the disciples and for them to recognize his messiahship in the middle of this broken, kind of dirty place. But isn't it just like Jesus to catch us off guard like this, and that's what he's doing here. It is a stunningly beautiful area, though. This is the spring at Caesarea Philippi, and it actually this river or stream becomes the Jordan River. It's one of three, I guess, tributaries you would say of the Jordan. Originally, there's some geological evidence that this cave was the source of the spring. So then, that led to all kinds of mythology about coming from the bowels of the earth kind of thing. And for that reason, it was the whole area was kind of a pagan holy site, so holy with a small h. And then a series of pagan temples were around. You can see these carvings, and we'll have other pictures that show it more closely. But basically, these grottos were carved, and they would have their idols and acts of worship. And basically, the area was dedicated to Pan, which is the Greek, god, half man, half goat, and imagine things with goats that I won't talk about. The following the Messiah clip, I'll link to that. That goes to this area in greater detail. PG version, of course. So again, one would rightfully question why Jesus would bring a impressionable, good Jewish boys to such a detestable place. And my guess is he didn't actually bring them here. That both Gospels that we read said, the region of Caesarea Philippi or the district or the villages of the area. My guess is he got close enough to make his point, and contrasting, that wicked place to be like on the outskirts of Las Vegas, maybe overlooking the town from the mountains outside, without actually going in. So contrasting, kind of what the world wants and what the world's take pleasure in with what Jesus and his unexpected, messiahship is going to bring them. Lancaster notes that there were many different views of the messiahs or messiahs in Jesus' time. They really all revolved around an earthly deliverance and an earthly kingdom, and so we're starting to see this theme here. So Peter is very right to call Jesus Messiah, and so let's not lose sight of this declaration by Peter. It's interesting that Jesus had not yet referred to himself as the Messiah, and really up until now, he had prohibited others, including demons, from labeling as such. So Peter, he allows Peter and commends Peter for doing so. But really up until now, rather than conforming to what a Messiah should be, Jesus seemed to confound kind of each of the disciples' messianic hope. So I think Keener picked up on the fact, let's not lose sight that what Peter meant by the term Messiah and what Jesus means by the term Messiah are still completely opposite at this point. Nearly everyone other than Jesus is still expecting a political Messiah. And Jesus is going to spend the next, 6, 7, 8 months, which basically, essentially is the rest of his time on earth, trying to explain what is about to happen. And he's going to start with the next few verses. The disciples are going to remain blind, really, until the resurrection. But still, let's not lose sight. Peter's confession is a watershed moment. It's a big deal, in a sense that everything that has come before what we've read in the Gospels has been leading up and working towards this declaration. Jesus is the one who will defeat Israel's enemies. He will restore Zion. He will restore the throne of David, just as his mother Mary prophesied that he would. However, as he's about to explain, the path he will take to get there will be a difficult one. So just as everything has kind of been leading up to this moment, after this declaration, everything is switching gears and is going to lead towards Jerusalem and towards the Passion story. Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter. On this rock I will build my church," ecclesia is the word there, "and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And he strictly charged his disciples to tell no one that he was Christ. We're running a little long here, so I'm going to skip the debate about Peter being the first pope and kind of some of the Catholic interpretations of this passage, which they lean a lot on. Some of it's correct, and some of it we could maybe take issue with. But suffice it to say, when he says, "I will build my church," he's not speaking of the church with a capital C, right? We've talked about the anachronistic fallacy of the divide between the Gentile church and then the Jewish believers that didn't happen until much later. So I'm not going to go into that again. The church is kind of an unfortunate term because in our minds we kind of read it as it has a capital C, right? Jesus's church. But really, the term it means ecclesia. A term is ecclesia, and it means assembly or congregation. The Bible calls the children of Israel the assembly when they were in the wilderness. But in any case, and for our part as Protestants, we try to kind of connive this passage into saying, well, Jesus is not talking about Peter. He's talking about, he's pointing to himself, saying he is the rock. So that's not in the text either. So let's make sure we're reading the text for what it is. He is uh, Jesus clearly elevating Peter here. Peter was the first to proclaim the Messiah to the Jewish people and the first to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. So he opened the door for the spread of the gospel, really to the whole world. So Jesus built the community of Messiah using Peter as the conduit. So let's make sure we give Peter his credit. Next, we have this gates of hell. It's kind of a strange term because regular gates just sit there. They're defensive structures. They don't attack anything. They don't overcome anything. Hell is kind of another charged term. The equivalent Hebrew term for Hades would be Sheol, and you can see that as you read the Old Testament. A lot of times that just gets transliterated instead of translated. So Sheol is more like grave or cemetery or resting place for the dead. It doesn't have any evil or satanic connotations like the word hell does. So therefore, what Jesus is saying here is that this assembly that Jesus is establishing will overcome the grave. Death shall not prevail. And that's fantastic news. The gates of hell also has some what we might call tour guide folklore. Whenever you go to Israel, you got to be wary that some tour guides like to embellish things and kind of spread legends, urban legends, or myths, that kind of thing. We talked about that the large opening, not the one you see in the picture, but the kind of just to the left of this is that giant opening where the water once flowed, and so this was very mystical to the ancients, and they believed that it led straight to Hades. Came from the belly of the earth, and that's where all the underworld of the dead were kind of congregated. So the cave was, sanctified in that respect and called the gates of Hades. So then, we would say the gates of hell. So then the theory goes is that Jesus is using geography to illustrate his point that, over there is, the literal gates of hell, but, this will not prevail. The most pagan and the most demonic activity will not prevail against the ecclesia kind of thing. That label of a cave is somewhat disputed, but, the lesson still works because today, as you can see in the picture, that's me and my beautiful wife, Sarah. We were there in 2010. And so pretty much the only people who go there now are Christians who travel there to celebrate Peter's magnificent confession, sorry, and kind of proclaiming that Jesus establishes his church, his assembly, basically proclaiming dominion over once wicked land. So that's kind of cool. Keys to the kingdom and binding and loosing. That's again kind of be taken the wrong way. Basically, they're Jewish legal terms. Keys can refer to teaching or law, case law. Binding and loosing would be like judgments, so forbidding or permitting. And we see this imagery used in Isaiah. The power to bind or loose, they couldn't nullify Torah, but it only applied to authoritative interpretation. So Jesus is clearly giving Peter that authority to lead his assembly, based on Peter's declaration. And then finally, why would they tell no one? It's like, didn't Jesus say the kingdom of heaven is upon us? Lancaster says that at this stage, with all of his enemies kind of surrounding him, if he had openly declared himself the Messiah, then his arrest and crucifixion would have come, faster than he wanted and not on his timetable. Everything that happens from here on out is going to be carefully orchestrated, and Jesus is going to be the one calling the shots, right down to the day that he's crucified. So, but for now, he needed his true mission and identity concealed. And again, we have to remember that the Judaioi believed that they held the authority. So for Jesus here to declare that he alone has the authority and he's bestowing it on Peter, they certainly would have taken issue with that as well. We haven't touched on a following Messiah tie-in. I've kind of forgotten about that, but Caesarea really is Caesarea Philippi is a can't miss stop on an Israeli tour. It's absolutely beautiful from a nature perspective, and then what happened there historically, and kind of the direction of the church and the pivotal point it is in Jesus' ministry, or can't really be overstated. So this segment, you can see the link, YouTube link there. It gives a great background on Caesarea Philippi, and then it talks about Peter's confession. It runs about 8 minutes, so I encourage you to check this out. From that time, and now we kind of turn the tide, and things get a little darker here. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed on the third day and be raised. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So again, major turning point. Some call Peter's confession the high watermark, because everything that has taken place before is kind of led up to his declaration, and then everything after is this carefully orchestrated path up to Jerusalem, and basically the Passion Week in that final week, and ultimately his crucifixion and resurrection. So the big deal here is that in verse 21, he's disclosing that game plan to his disciples. Jesus, of course, knew it all along, but now he's kind of letting it be known what's going to happen in no uncertain terms. And of course, we know what Peter's infamous reaction was. So we have to remember that we in the 21st century have 2020 hindsight. We know what happens to Jesus, but let's not lose sight of how shocking this must have been for the disciples to hear. Remember, they're still partially blind, right? Jesus had just confirmed Peter's statement that he was the Messiah, and now he says he's going to suffer and die instead of taking his rightful place as king in the Messianic kingdom. They would have acknowledged that the Old Testament text referred to the Messiah as suffering, but really most Jewish people in the first century believed the Messiah would be to reign as king. So basically, they expected a political king. Jesus was supposed to inaugurate a kind of a perfect millennial kingdom as God's appointed ruler. And then Jesus explains his mission. It seems to contradict kind of everything that they believed, and even contradicted Peter's confession. So kind of what's going on here. So you can kind of see how they might have been confused. So get behind me, Satan. Very strong language. Keener notes that Jesus probably used hyperbole to make the point. Peter is similar to Satan in preferring the worldly to the divine, and so calling Peter by the name of the ultimate tempter and accuser underlines the seriousness of his failure as a disciple at this point. And so this is kind of that's Keener's take. The proper position of a disciple was supposed to be behind his master, following him, and so saying "get behind me" is a call to have Peter, take back his rightful position as a follower here. And then I would pick up that just as during the temptation, Satan offered Jesus an alternative by showing him, all the kingdom of the world, giving him a shortcut. Peter was kind of insisting on the same thing here. So basically, Jesus is saying, "Think before I think," but he's saying it in much more direct terms. All right, wrap us up back in Mark 8. Then, calling the disciples to him, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." So this is a picture of pilgrims today carry their cross in the traditional route of the Via Dolorosa that's in Jerusalem. So again, we have to remember that the cross, as we know it, hadn't happened for them yet. It's another 6 to 8 months in the future for the disciples. But in a way, this fact makes Jesus' statement even more grim than it may be to us. I think when we think of denying ourselves, we're talking about skipping dessert or something like that. We use imagery such as put your head on the chopping block or go before the firing squad to describe some unpleasant confrontation, but not one that's lethal, right? In that day, crucifixion was reserved for the lowest of criminals. It was so brutal, it wasn't even permitted, let alone conceived under Jewish law. So to take the cross meant to carry that horizontal beam to the site of one's execution, and then generally past a jeering mob who was, spitting at you and throwing things at you, just like we know that Jesus endured. Um, Basically, we need to lay down our lives and be prepared to do so in the most painful way. And that's not easy to hear. It's not exactly a seeker-friendly message, is it? But we as Talmudim hopefully have graduated far beyond the state of being seeker-friendly. Dr. Wayne Stiles has a website where he also visits sites in Israel and comments on them. He says, whenever someone took up a cross in Jesus' day, that person was not coming back. Taking up our cross daily represents what the Apostle Paul would later describe as offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. This death to self can only happen as we renew our minds, or to use Jesus' words to Peter, as we set our minds on God's interest rather than man. So I think that's a great quote. And then at the end, Jesus is really saying the alternative is worse. In verse 38, Jesus does affirm that the disciples' messianic expectations were not entirely without warrant. Everything will one day be set right. The people doing those wicked things in Caesarea Philippi have a far worse fate coming to them than the disciples of Jesus who deny themselves to the point of submitting to crucifixion. So it will all work out, but the road will not be easy. And then to wrap it up, truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God, until after it has come with power. Many have interpreted this along the way that the second coming was supposed to occur in that generation. We got a couple of things that happen, though. We have the transfiguration, is what we'll get to in the next lesson. A handful of disciples will see Jesus in his glory. And then we also have kinds of, as if to underscore, John, when he's the last living person there, who was, not everyone else had tasted death except John. Then John saw the Son of Man coming in glory with the angels just before his death. And then he wrote it all down in the book we know as the Revelation. So we have the Transfiguration and the Revelation. They're but hints of greater things to come. Verse 1 doesn't say that the second coming will happen before they taste death, but we get hints of God's coming in his power. All right, so this lesson is really about the education of the disciples. So let's try and look back at kind of a 30,000 foot view. So we had the healing of the deaf man, we had the feeding of the 4,000, after both of which the disciples were, described as having eyes do you not see, having ears do you not hear. Then we have the two-stage healing of the blind man, and then followed by the trip up to Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" Peter has his great confession, but then the very next thing Jesus says is that the Messiah must die and he will be given over. And then Peter says, "It shall not be." So Peter's still blind at this point. "Get behind me, Satan." And he tells the disciples they're going to have to take up their cross. And then finally, he says the Messiah will rule. Basically, the Messiah you're looking for will happen, but a lot of other things have to happen first. So in the two healings, Mark conspicuously includes a lot of extra details, and scholars believe that this is to illustrate the opening of the disciples' eyes and ears in the same way. It was kind of a slow process that Jesus had to give a lot of extra attention to. He couldn't just say the word from a distant city and have it be done. He had to, this required some hands-on work here. And then the whole sequence concludes with Peter's declaration of the Master as the Messiah, Jesus' disclosure of his mission in more detail, and the glorious of the second coming. So basically, it all turns out well in the end. So our application here, what can we learn about ourselves and our walk with Jesus from the people that he interacted with? So that's kind of a question. Look at all of these people, the deaf man, the blind man, the leadership, the disciples, Peter, both in good and bad states. How is that like us, and how can we learn from that? How does seeing a struggle for the kingdom as a temporary privilege instead of something painful, does that change our view of the word struggle? And of course, Jesus made the question personal. Who do you say that I am? So each of us are called to answer that. So next time we will look at the transfiguration. And until then, may God bless your study of his word and use these words to draw you closer to him. And we will see you next time.